how do we handle an increasingly divergent set of policies on the network with regard to transactions standardness or filtering? Are we merging things based on how loud you are on Twitter? Is this going to be a democracy? Are we going to be able to do controversial but correct things in the future? I think it's reasonable to want Bitcoin core developers to vocally say that they support Bitcoin as money. The folks who are running with stricter settings and wanting to limit spam on their node or on the network more broadly are more so wanting to send a message that Bitcoin is money and spam not welcome.
The Blockworks Digital Asset Summit, crypto's premier institutional event, is coming back to London this October, the 13th to the 15th. You'll hear from top names across global finance, DeFi, and policy. Think BlackRock, Circle, Coinbase, and the UK Parliament. Notable speakers already locked in include Danny Masters from CoinShares, Jeff Park from Bitwise, and plenty more to come. There's also a VIP dinner on October the 13th. That's for speakers and VIP ticket holders only. It will sell out. It's all happening at the Old Billingsgate in London. Use code SUPPLY100 at checkout for £100 off.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed. Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X, here with another great episode of Supply Shock. We're going to be diving deep into the current Bitcoin culture and technical wars. Of course, we've covered a lot on this podcast. Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Knots, an emergent implementation of Bitcoin that is also a critique of the wider development culture. Here to break it down, we've got Mike Schmidt, Executive Director at Brink, one of the largest funders of Bitcoin development and also a contributor to the Bitcoin OpTech newsletter, one of the best resources out there if you're looking to get plugged in to what the Bitcoin core developers are working on today. Mike, welcome to the program.
Thanks for asking me on, Pete. Good to be here.
Yeah, well, wish it was under better circumstances, right? There's a lot of misconceptions about the core development process. So maybe we can start with broad strokes, right? Bitcoin Core is an open source software project, employs or doesn't employ, right? Because a lot of these folks are volunteers, hundreds of people who are, engrossed in the minutia of the Bitcoin code and how it works. So maybe we can start just kind of winding it back. There's kind of this demonization of Bitcoin Core of late, kind of this accusation that it's some sort of monolithic body, that it perhaps is sort of a centralized entity. Would love to hear your rebuttal on knowing the inner workings of the group, the conglomerate.
Yeah, you mentioned my contributions to OpTech. So, from a technical perspective, I've been doing that for 7 years, watching Bitcoin developments, much of which are in Bitcoin Core. Watching the repository, the discussions, and then having formed Brink 5 years ago and being a little bit closer to the metal there with some of the folks, you sort of have like a long perspective in looking at this. And if folks are saying, hey, this is centralized, I guess what I would say is we have something like, let's say 30 or 40 full-time engineers working on Bitcoin Core in a given year, maybe another 100 who are not full-time, maybe they're part-time, or maybe they have a review or a pull request here or there. So that feels like a decent number. Now we're getting to be a $2.5, $3 trillion network. Should we have more of those engineers? Probably. Would that help with any sort of centralization concerns? Probably. Help with bus factor? Yes. But I think, it's not a dire spot from the individual's perspective, having that number of individuals. And then if you look at the organizations, there's more than there's ever been funding. So you have, I think 1A1Z put out a report last year on funding Bitcoin development. I think there's something like 12 different organizations that are contributing funding. And that's not the donors, that's the actual organizations that are either giving out grants or employing engineers. And so to have a dozen for like 3 or 4 dozen engineers feels like a pretty good spot. Now, some groups focus on different types of software. There's some that are funding more than others, but that feels pretty good to me.
Well, let's maybe get closer to the center of the dust up here. Bitcoin Core releases, major real software releases, on a pretty consistent cadence at this point. We're heading up to a major release now, version 30. So in version 30, there's a particular change that, some within the Bitcoin Core community say has reached technical consensus. And this has to do with the data carrier size and the op return limit. So these are two specific aspects of the software. The first op return, added to the software back in 2014, essentially allows data to be embedded along with transactions, and then data carrier size really deals with how that data is routed around the network to nodes and miners who are again, involved in this great decentralized process of moving Bitcoin forward. So maybe let's start with this technical consensus, right? So there's this idea amongst the users that this is a controversial change, but there's this assertion, I believe, from the Bitcoin Core folks that this change has technical consensus and that there isn't really, maybe valid objections to the changes that have been made. So maybe we could talk about technical consensus and how it has come together in this instance and then more generally.
Yeah, I mean, consensus, unfortunately, in the Bitcoin world is a super overloaded term, right? We actually have the protocol, consensus on the protocol, consensus engine, and then there's, consensus about consensus. So let's say if someone's proposing a soft fork, is there consensus on that protocol change? And then, what you're referring to is like technical consensus for a non-consensus change. In this case, policy, right? So you have sort of protocol changes, very infrequent, can be controversial, and then working your way down, you have policy changes that are within a particular software. In this case, Bitcoin Core is the controversy around that. And then you have a bunch of other technical things that go on with node development, like Bitcoin Core, for example, security bug fixes, changing the logging, things like this that are sort of maybe below a lot of people's level of caring. But for op return, if you look at the pull request, the one that was merged that raised the limit, if you look, there's on GitHub, there's this drop bot, and it'll sort of summarize who's act and who's NACT or concept act, and it sort of puts it all at the top there, so you don't have to scroll and count yourself throughout all the comments. And if you look, you'll see a lot on both sides for this particular proposed change in GitHub. But if you look at the regular contributors, or not even regular contributors, but people who've contributed maybe at all to the project, it's pretty clear that it has consensus amongst the developers to be merged. I think at some point I counted, I think it was something like 20-1 in the most recent PR. Maybe it was 20-2 in the previous PR or something like that. So the developers feel like, hey, we're responsible for this software, and we think that the default should be raised, and enough people agreed for that to be merged. Although, I understand, community has concerns, of course.
Right. So let's talk about that particular breakdown. So this is what when I use the term technical consensus, I think this is what I mean, right? The contributors to the software who, through that personal effort have, earned some right to infer on the process of how Bitcoin should develop, are demonstrating their opinion. They're united sort of on this being the best course forward. Could you maybe just, before we continue and talk about the opposition, just summarize their position on why it's the best course forward, talking about, how this helps with, the distribution of transactions on the network and small miners and just the thought process there?
Yeah. So the idea is we as a community agreed, whatever it is, about 10 years ago now, hey, there's an infinite number of ways that you can shim data into Bitcoin. Why don't we all agree to put it here in the op return, right? And, I think at first it was 40 bytes and moved to 80 some bytes, 83 bytes, right? And And that was about 10 years ago, right? But because there's infinite ways to put data into a system that supports arbitrary scripting like Bitcoin does, other methods were developed, namely inscriptions, right? And so that is another possibility for people who want to put data in, which I am not a fan of JPEGs on the blockchain. Maybe you and I differ there. But I'm
I
trying
think
to
we do a
be
little bit. Yeah.
trying to be a realist that it is possible to put data, including JPEGs, on the blockchain. So you have this inscription envelope, this inscription technique. One of, again, you could use Opportune, you could use inscriptions, and there's other schemes that can be developed. There's infinite ways to do this. So looking, what was happening is folks were working around the 80 byte Opportune limit and doing so by putting fake pub keys. So, hey, I need to put, let's say, 150 bytes of data, and I need it to be in an output. I get 80 bytes with an Opporune. I'm just going to create some fake addresses and put in data into those addresses such that I can still be a standard transaction and get broadcast to the broader network due to my needs for that to be done. In this case, the example was a layer 2 protocol that needed that for part of their mechanism. And I'm going to use the Opportunity, and I'm going to put some stuff in these fake addresses. And so that's harmful to Bitcoin. And that mechanism was developed over a period of time, and it just came to the attention of Antoine. I think they were in the hallway at a MIT conference, and Antoine and someone from Citria had come up, and he's saying, wow, we created Opportunity to be the, and the limit to be a way for people to put data in the most, the least harmful way. And that limit is now actually causing harm, right? Because now people are putting it in these fake pub keys. And so, hey, why don't we just nuke that limit so that we don't have that perverse incentive? And now there's some discussion around, well, do you nuke it totally, or do you make it, 160, and then relitigate that every so often? But so the core developer's position was, this is actually a malincentive now. What used to be an incentive to do it the right way is actually a malincentive to partially do it the right way and then use the rest of your data in a very bad way. So let's fix that limit. And the inscription envelope is available to folks who want to put in giant stuff already. So raising it from 80 to a higher number, it's sort of a wash.
Right. There's this idea that people are kind of doing this unintended, behavior. Some users are just demonstrating this unintended behavior. We want to do it in the least negative way possible. So what do you say to folks? I mean, it seems like pretty broadly amongst the NOTs community, or people who are dissatisfied with Bitcoin Core, they seem to want the body collective to openly be discouraging certain activities, right? I think it almost feels like what they want is for Bitcoin Core to come out and sort of condemn or try to stop, those use cases of Bitcoin that they don't, feel aligned with. Even me saying use cases of Bitcoin would likely, send them into a bit of a hernia. So, like, how do you deal with, that impulse, right? They seem to want Bitcoin Core to be an enforcer of the rules and to sort of dictate behavior. Why should Bitcoin Core not dictate the behavior of users?
There's two pieces to what you said. One is, I think, reasonable, and then one I think is less reasonable. I think it's reasonable to want Bitcoin Core developers to vocally say that they support Bitcoin as money, which they do. We've had merch posts that this is what he's dedicated is. He wants Bitcoin as the internet's money. Sipa or Peter Woola in a stack.
It's kind of gross though, because it feels like it's like you're sort of making people pledge allegiance.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it should be forced, right? But I think it's reasonable to say, hey, we all think this is money. You think it's money, like maybe say so. That seems more reasonable. I don't think it's maybe not to demand it or to have some sort of a signatory or something, but I can understand that impulse, right? And then the second one is, let's start essentially playing, whack-a-mole with these different of the infinite ways to put data into Bitcoin. Let's start playing whack-a-mole to dissuade it, right? So that was 2.5 years ago now with Luke's PR to filter inscriptions, right? And then there's notes of that here with the op return, although it's not necessarily the same thing because the op return is really just more of a harm reduction thing more than an overt spam thing. But it does bring in those notes of this, spam debates of a few years ago. And, we can double click into that if you want as well.
Yeah, obviously there's been a long kind of history of, people attempting to, limit spam or find some way. I would say, Adam Back is sort of the even, promoting right now in kind of the public discourse that, it should be a positive impulse of the community to, actually find ways to reduce spam and sort of painting that, as a positive action that, some developers could take. I think the way that he's framed it is that, and maybe Peter Todd as well has done this, has said, if there's some principled way to stop it, we would enact something to stop it. It's just there isn't a principled way. What do you think about this particular argument of sort of positioning out as this is the best solution to the problem, but there could be better solutions to the quote problem?
Yeah, I mean, I just I don't think the op return is really even a solution to the spam at all. It's just simply allowing less harmful ways to embed basically smaller pieces of data, because the larger pieces are going to go to inscriptions anyways. But I would agree with the sentiment that there isn't really a principled way to stop it. You could work towards the consensus level, right, and start eliminating things there. But as we've seen, policy isn't a great way to limit this stuff. I do think that filters do add marginal disincentive when they're in place broadly on the network. But the question is, is that the only factor, right? So we've had for example, min fee rate filter on the network, basically 100% adoption for, I don't know how long, a decade, which I would think at the beginning of this controversy would have been a shining example of how filters work. But in the middle of this argument over the last 6 months, you've had this sub-Satoshi fee rate summer happen, and we have 30-40% of blocks bypassing that filter, right? And that's with not having it as default, core not having it as the default, and then all of a sudden we have tens of millions of transactions that are bypassing that filter. And so I think it's tough to have a marginal disincentive work when there is a strong incentive for people to bypass that. And so the people being the transactors and the miners, right? So I think it's just a few nodes on the network that had a liberal relay policy for the sub-Satoshi relaying, and then, one or two miners started, a few jumped on, some of them have backed off the number, but we're definitely below 1 Satoshi per VByte in terms of fee rate. And no software has been deployed that has that as a default. So I think it's hard to say that policy can, it adds a marginal incentive one way or another, but as we see here in this example, it just isn't the defining factor.
Yeah, I've heard the sub V1 VByte summer referenced a lot. Where did this start, and what was the impetus? Was this to specifically disprove the filter thesis, or what's the origin of this?
I don't know the inside baseball on who did it. The usual suspect for loosening these sorts of things is Peter Todd, but to my knowledge, it's not the default in his Libra relay. So he has a fork just like Knots that has very, very liberal policies. And my understanding is that it did not originate with Libra Relay or Peter Todd. And that I think Marathon was maybe the first on the mining side to do it, and then others sort of followed suit. I think they brought it down to 0.1 Satoshis per VByte originally, and some of those miners have since reconsidered a higher value due to the potential risk and the low reward of that. I don't know exactly what they're going for. I know a lot of the core engineers are scratching their heads on why miners would would do that, sort of picking pennies up in front of the steamroller kind of thing, but also, setting now the fee rate floor much lower from a policy perspective. So I don't know exactly where it originated, but it wasn't NOTs, it wasn't Libra Relay, it wasn't Core. It was just a few nodes on the network that preferentially peered with each other so they could relay these small fee transactions to one another. And one of the miners started accepting it, and it sort of snowballed from there. And now, as part of V30, Bitcoin Core will also be lowering their default min relay fee rate as well.
So maybe we could talk about just, the node operators here. So there's been a lot of talk in the conversation about, people transacting, paying fees, miners accepting those fees. There's been a bit of a renaissance of this, rhetoric that we saw a lot around the fork wars of, run a node. If you're running a node, you are a Bitcoin user. Obviously, a lot of the political rhetoric there, a lot of, Bitcoin ideology kind of at play. But the fact of the matter remains, people can run nodes. They can choose which relay policies, if they want, to do that. So what would you say, I guess, to people who, don't want to upgrade because of this? They want to set their relay policy to something that's more flexible. They have the right to do that, obviously, right?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that we've said for years before this dust up is, hey, it's all open source. Obviously, NOTS has been going along for quite a long time. As a sort of parallel implementation, you have knobs now. It has, more options for those sorts of people.
Is that a real software that someone is working on?
I haven't run it. I know Tidwell has a repository. I don't know how serious of an effort it is. But then you also have Libra Relay, who has similar settings to Bitcoin Core, just set very, very liberally. So folks have options for what they want to do. There's the degree that a single node runner can impact the network is quite low. But obviously there's sovereignty there that people desire, and they want to set that option. And in Bitcoin Core, that the data carrier option is not deprecated for version 30. So people can sort of feel confidence that they can use that at least somewhat into the future if they choose to turn that particular knob as well. So yeah, it's open source. This is, no one's stopping anybody from doing any of this. There's obvious consequences. I think, this has been hashed a million times to the individual node runner. I think that those are somewhat marginal in terms of, fee estimation has been brought up, and block reconstruction and things like that. I think the folks who are running with stricter settings and wanting to limit spam on their node or on the network more broadly are probably less concerned about those sort of marginal effects, and are more so wanting to send a message that Bitcoin is money and spam not welcome.
Right. Maybe let's pry into that mindset a little bit. Obviously, it would seem like facts would be enough to rebut that, right? Bitcoin is still useful as money, even though we've had inscriptions and, all this arbitrary data added to Bitcoin. But I don't know. So what would you say to somebody, why is them setting their own policy detrimental to themselves? Or why would Bitcoin Core maybe not take a more, expressly positive stance towards people doing that, right? And sort of this idea that we should be empowering sort of the node operators to make decisions. I guess maybe you could tell me how you think through this question, which is, I guess, sort of this idea of, obviously people are now running another software that's not Bitcoin Core. Do you feel like they're probably aware of the risks of doing that?
I think probably this particular pull request and option and filter and policy has been discussed maybe more than any other policy or filter previously, maybe more so than any topic in Bitcoin since the block size wars. So I think people are aware of it. I think the risks they see are marginal to themselves. And I think that to the degree that there's been detriment to the network or potential detriment to the network from having these settings, the NOTS is making changes accordingly to compensate for that. So for example, if I'm running a NOTS node and I'm simply discarding a lot of spam, and then a block comes in with spam in it. And if I do not have those transactions, I'm going to have to request those transactions. It's going to take time. And then I'm going to basically be slower to validate and then propagate the block along with those transactions to my peers, which can be risky for smaller miners because smaller miners may be waiting as a peer of yours for that. And so I think Knots has recently changed some of the way that they handle that. So they actually have a bigger, it's not a mempool, but it's like this V extra pool where they keep transactions that they're caching, but they're not relaying. And so I think they went from like 100 transactions in there to like 32,000 transactions in that cache so that they can not relay those transactions that they don't like. But when it comes in, when and if it comes in a block, they can use those cache transactions to make sure that block propagation doesn't slow down. So there's risk to the individual, there's risk to the network. I think folks are working on both. What is ultimately achieved is unclear, since we have seen just a few nodes on the network bypass policy to the tune of 40%, 50% of blocks, 10 million transactions. So I don't know big picture what's going to happen, but obviously there's some node sovereignty that I can appreciate that people want to defend.
Why shouldn't technical consensus bend to just the popular will? It seems to be almost that, the Knots group sort of is saying, well, it's unpopular, so it shouldn't be done. Why is that not a good enough argument, simply that users don't like the change?
Yeah, I think it's tough. I mean, maybe in the future there will be separate implementations that do set defaults based on popularity. But I think Bitcoin Core is pretty strong on wanting to have the technically correct implementation, maybe even to some point being heavy-handed in this discussion about it. And I think that the risk then is that you have folks opining on the software and you start getting into, are we merging things based on the emojis in GitHub? Are we merging things based on how loud you are on Twitter? Is this going to be a democracy? Are we going to be able to do controversial but correct things in the future if it truly is, sort of like a voting system, right? And so I think people are worried about that being a sort of slippery slope.
If you go in the annals of Bitcoin history, this has even been tried, right? Bitcoin Classic did employ a tool called consider.it, which allowed, node operators to vote on direct policies that it would add to the software. So there's been this idea that, the technical process should bend to democracy, within Bitcoin for a while, though we haven't really seen any uptake of that.
It's hard, right? Because, Bitcoin, we want this to be, everybody can participate, but without things like proof of work or some such thing, you have these civil attacks, right? Where, you can't trust that this number of nodes on the network are really more than one person, right? And so you can't really vote with a node because you could write a script and spawn a bunch of them, and maybe you get some IP addresses, or maybe you have them on Tor. I think people need to be careful about that, in particular with a lot of this node count that I see posted often. I have no doubt that directionally the move to knots is correct, but I think people should be a little bit guarded by, that number going up, and that truly represents individuals. But that's just a little, maybe a sidebar to the discussion of like, it's hard to be Sybil resistant in this, sort of pseudonymous system that we have with being able to vote and things like that.
Well, maybe let's rip the Band-Aid off on one of the thornier parts of this, where it does seem like for some folks this is purely political. They seem to see Bitcoin Core as some sort of failing left-wing institution that, it's sort of, cultural norms are consistent with things like the United Nations or, the U.S. Congress, or, and, there is a rise in populism globally right now, and sort of return to this idea that, strong nationalistic domestic leadership. Obviously Bitcoin Core, doesn't have a strong leadership. Other, versions of the Bitcoin software had strong leadership. Those strong leaders, were eventually removed through the process of the fork wars. So why isn't Bitcoin Core, or why shouldn't it be looked at as, one of these institutions that are under more scrutiny in the world today, maybe university systems, academia, health. There's a lot of skepticism towards, just popular science these days and academic science.
I think Bitcoin Core should be scrutinized. And I think part of maybe where my perspective comes in is I think we should do that we should scrutinize Bitcoin Core for things that they're doing and that are true. And then we can focus on that signal, right? Hey, this is happening. We disagree with this change for these reasons, and not necessarily, there's a lot of superfluous arguments. I think I saw something yesterday or the day before that, one of the organizations is going to be corrupted because they got a $500,000 donation from Balaji, right? And it's just a little ridiculous, since that organization has been funding engineers for over 10 years. And I don't think that $500,000 would pay their office rent for a year, for example. So I think Bitcoin Core's critics would be better served by arguing and criticizing Bitcoin Core for things that have happened, as opposed to sort of some of these hypotheticals. And even when we get into the opportune, as we've gotten into some of the opportune discussion here, things that they have said or not said versus things that people, are trying to maybe straw man them into. So I guess my response would be Bitcoin Core should be criticized, but let's make the criticisms, based in reality.
Well, I've personally been pretty shocked. I talked to a lot of the old timers, and even amongst some of the older software users, there's this peripheral view that Bitcoin Core, and some of the participants in it, maybe aren't users enough, right? That they're not running nodes themselves, they're not owning Bitcoin, they don't have the same sort of level of stake, in the system as users. I think really what's happening here is there's this assertion that sort of this funding mechanisms that have been set up are essentially self-selecting for the wrong type of people, right? Like the alternative to a funding system, like the system that you help carry out with Brink, is that self-motivated people would work on the software as they were motivated, and maybe they wouldn't experience any return from that. So I guess how do you deal with the claim that the actual funding apparatus around Bitcoin Core has in some way perverted the incentives of the group?
I mean, there's a lot we can get into there. I don't think it's perverted the incentives. I can explain a little bit about how Brink works. I think other organizations may be similar. I can't speak to them as well. Just speak from my own perspectives with this organization. We have a independent board. We have an independent grant committee with folks who have been participating for, in some cases, Corey, over a decade, right? And what we're looking at when we're looking at applicants and when we're looking at renewing existing engineers is, what is the impact to Bitcoin if this person can do what they say in their application, right? And part of that then is, what are they looking to do? And part of that is their history. So Brink doesn't really fund speculatively. We want to see proof of work before we'll fund somebody. So already up front, that person's probably done some work on their own, whether that's nights and weekends, or they took a sabbatical from their job to do this. And so these folks are already showing proof of work, from the beginning, and we're just really giving them the funding to continue to do what they think is best for Bitcoin. And then we agree that that's going to be impactful to Bitcoin, and we'll fund them. And so through the board, the grant committee, and myself, we all are looking at these applications, figuring out what's most impactful. And then totally unrelated to that is, fundraising, which is saying, hey, here's the good work that these engineers are doing. We think it's important. If you would like to contribute, they contribute to us, no strings attached, our donors, and then we fund no strings attached grants to the engineers. And so there's really no window for sort of the level of like influence that people think that a donor might have to Brink on the engineers. And quite the contrary, I find it hard to even get donors interested sometimes in the technicals. And so I think a lot of the perception online is that these folks are very interested in these protocol changes and that they're thinking 5 years out. And if we can just, bribe Brink to do something 5 years out, whereas the contrary is usually the case, and that maybe we'll have a few conversations with the donor early on. And I try to update them with progress maybe a couple of times throughout the year about what engineers are doing. But there's not really a lot of dialogue there, and there's not opportunity for them to try to influence the engineers regardless.
Can you speak at all to the mood within the Bitcoin core development community at the moment and how they perceive, the current, uproar amongst users? I mean, is there kind of a worry about the situation that people might kind of gravitate towards another implementation, or just what's the perception about there has been a heavy critique on the work now, probably in a way that hasn't really happened since the block size wars. Just curious for your perspective on, how folks are handling it.
Yeah, I think the perspective is probably one of just, this is unfortunate in that this seemingly small issue has been blown into sort of this mini civil war. I don't think that they felt like their rationale has been properly understood by the broader community. And I think that could get into, I think a reasonable criticism of the group and some of us surrounding the group, which is just communicating better. Not communicating better because if you just said it, maybe everyone would agree with you, but just we could focus on where the actual deltas are instead of some of the noise. So I think that, that maybe there's some frustration that they feel like their rationale isn't being heard more broadly, and that instead there's sort of these other objections that are being made to their work that maybe are either not relevant or in a lot of cases not true at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that, even in myself, there has been, I've noticed a bit of a pulling away from the development community, maybe after the fork wars. It is less common to see folks from the Bitcoin core development community at conferences, out there on podcasts, and kind of doing, the public spotlight, wherein, 2017, 2016, Bitcoin core contributors would have been sort of in the main speaking slots at major events and things like that. Do you think that outreach is how this gets solved, as folks step up and they take that mantle?
I think better communication is there. It needs to be there. Regardless, it doesn't, that again, I'll caveat that again to say that doesn't mean that this would have just been solved because the core developers are just so brilliant. If you just only understood them and communicated it better, this would all go away. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think, to your point about maybe 10 years ago versus now, this is a much larger ecosystem, right? And so in the beginning, Satoshi was the evangelist, the developer, the miner, he was everything, right? And now we have entire industries that have split off over the years for each of those. The mining folks don't know much about development. Development doesn't know much about energy contracts. We have this whole financial, space that has sprung up with ETFs and, MicroStrategy and Bitcoin treasury companies. There's all these silos that have sort of, formed. And so I think one of those silos is development, right? And even within, Bitcoin core development or Bitcoin development, even there, if you look at the, people working on scripting and protocol and software proposals, a lot of those people aren't core developers anymore either, right? So you see this sort of division of labor, or, specialization of labor, if you will, where as the industry has grown, people are specializing. And I think the Bitcoin core engineers are specializing in engineering, software engineering for the Bitcoin core software. And now you have people who have started specializing in protocol proposals for the Bitcoin protocol who aren't those core engineers. And then you have, influencers, and you have the financial people. And so I think that's to say, I think it's a natural thing that has happened with sort of people sort of siloing a bit based on what they're interested in, what they're focused in. And so the solution then is how do these Bitcoin core engineers working on the software, how do they provide a mechanism for these other components of the industry to understand their work at the level that's needed. And I think that's, something that I've been thinking about of takeaways, from this past 6 months.
Well, maybe winding down here, it seems like we're headed towards a world where there are multiple implementations that are at least semi-widely run, maybe take a 10 to 20% of the network on knots. There's talk about people launching other implementations, at least a couple projects, rumored. Is Bitcoin ready for a multi-implementation world, where people are able to pick from these different softwares, or are there still core consensus risks here that you think will prohibit that from becoming the new norm?
The alternate implementations that are out there and the ones that are rumored to come out there, I think are all going to be, or are going to be forks of Bitcoin core software base. And I don't anticipate any of them to be changing the consensus parts of that code base. So I think when you hear the old, Satoshi quote about, second implementation is a menace kind of quote, I think it's probably less applicable in this scenario where the consensus engine is in theory untouched. Now, you have to make sure good engineering goes into these other implementations that they don't touch that.
Is it robust enough though? Because I know that there were efforts to isolate the consensus code base, and I don't know that those were ever completed, right?
Yeah, it's in progress. It's actually made pretty good progress. So the Bitcoin kernel, so not to be confused with libbitcoin, the node implementation, but libbitcoin kernel, or just the Bitcoin core kernel, is a project that's advanced pretty rapidly over the last few years after sort of being stagnant. So the charlatan's been working on that. And I think there's talk that maybe that could be ready in some form for consumption in, version 31. And so what that is sort of isolating Bitcoin Core's consensus engine into its own library. And you can do a lot of interesting things like that. One thing that we're talking about here is you could build a node implementation on top of it. In fact, I think Antoine Riard has a proof of concept doing that with Rust, just sort of playing around with it. Another thing you could do is you could do analysis or sort of data on blocks. If you're wanting to run queries on Bitcoin's data set, you can use the kernel for things like that. So it doesn't have to be specifically a node implementation. There's a lot of interesting APIs that it provides for folks to do data analysis and other things. So it has made good progress, but I think, hopefully people aren't messing with the consensus engine if they're doing a software fork. And then obviously with a more diverse network, if that's what we're looking for in the future, or if that's what we're looking towards in the future, then how do we handle an increasingly divergent set of policies on the network with regard to transaction standardness or filtering? And there's some ideas being floated on the Delving Bitcoin forums. We cover it in Bitcoin OpTech as well. AJ Towns has, a shared block template idea where nodes would share their block templates with one another as a way to discover what their peers think might get mined, as opposed to just looking at the node itself. And that's a way to also discover other transactions potentially. So that's just an idea at this point, but people are thinking about what might a diverse mempool network look like, and trying to mitigate the potential downsides of that.
Final question here, Mike. We're heading maybe towards a world where, or it seems like definitely a world where arbitrary data will still be on Bitcoin, right? We'll still need and want this one. People are using it for these financial applications, these different layer twos. Obviously, there's hope that ZK snarks and Starks and zero knowledge technology could be compressed and help scale Bitcoin. So it's not going away. There are some folks who seem dead set on a Bitcoin version where this is impossible. Do you think we're headed towards a chain split into two separate coins? Is Bitcoin ready for this? How do you feel about the possibility?
I know people are talking about that. It all seems like very early talk. My personal perspective is that JPEGs on Bitcoin or spam on Bitcoin is not an existential threat or a mortal threat to Bitcoin. So I don't see this rising to the level of needing a consensus change. And if you did, you would need to change a few things because, like I mentioned, there's just a lot of infinite ways to put data in Bitcoin. So I don't know that that's going to have legs. At least in my opinion, it's maybe not worth the risk to do a protocol change for something that isn't a threat to Bitcoin. Maybe would much rather see something like the consensus cleanup, where there actually is a bug in the Bitcoin protocol, and maybe we should fix something like that as a next go. But obviously, ultimately, it's the community's decision if we're talking protocol stuff. So who knows?
Mike, where can people find out more about your work? How can they contribute to Brink if they would like to do so?
Yeah, so brink.dev is the website, brink.dev, and you can read about what our engineers are up to. We have a blog with some technical content. We have a YouTube channel where we record some of our monthly engineering calls, sometimes with special guests, and we put those up for people to watch. We've had Russell O'Connor talking about provable cryptography. We had Eric Voskuil on talking about IBD and some of the stuff he's doing with the Bitcoin. So check out brink.dev to find that. Also, like I mentioned, I've been contributing to Bitcoin OffTech for quite some time. We have a weekly newsletter that covers this sort of tech if you're interested on the tech side. And then Merch and I also do a podcast each week as well. And there's a topics wiki. There's all kinds of good stuff there. So if you're interested in the tech, check that out.
Of course, you can check out Merch. He was the most recent podcast of Supply Shock. Go over to YouTube, smash that like and subscribe button. Stay tuned. Mike, appreciate you being on the program. For folks who are out there on the internet listening, go to blockworks.co/events. Coming up soon, just weeks away now from Digital Asset Summit out in London. Going to see a convergence of the financial mainstream and the heart of one of the oldest financial systems in the world with the Bitcoin and crypto world. You can go to blockworks.co/events. Still time to get tickets, VIP tickets, and more. Of course, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast. We'll see you next time.